Well, yeah, but I want to get you on that camera.
It's a quote. It's a quote.
What does that mean?
We don't know.
Remember?
No one knows.
High school.
We didn't know. All I know is I literally go, we're not posting that.
Who's gonna call Michael? Hey, Mikey. I was just wondering if you could just zoom in so we can test the connection. Okay, 5 minutes, gotcha, thank you. He had a mouthful of chicken, so. He'll be there in 5 minutes. Oh my God. She's like half the person. Since our wedding?
Screen, PowerPoint screen, and then we can do it later.
Okay. Here?
One of the 3 of us, one of the 4 of us, one of you 2, one of all of us, one of the interns.
all set, guys? Good? What do you do when your hero dies? When they're gone? The person that you look to for guidance and inspiration, the person who would always tell you what you needed to hear, even if it wasn't what you wanted to hear. The person who believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself. That's the question that I've been asking almost daily for the last 11 months. See, my hero, my older brother, Greg, lost his battle to cancer last July. So let that question sit with you, ruminate on it, and let it kind of run in the background, and we'll come back to it at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you, and welcome to everyone who's streaming this on YouTube. My name is Jim Carlin, and on behalf of myself and my family and the CARE Coalition, we welcome you this evening to what we hope will be an opportunity to laugh a little bit, share some stories, maybe shed a tear or two, and more than anything, to create a space of healing and peace. A little bit of background on me before we get started. I'm currently a member of the board of directors of the CARE Coalition. I was first introduced to our organization a few years ago following the publication of my book, which talks about my time in a psychiatric hospital and my recovery from anxiety and depression. Now, I am not the hero of this story, not by a long shot. Two of those heroes will be speaking tonight. One is joining us by Zoom, one is seated here in the front row, and the other one is joining us in spirit. In the wake of the book's publication, Kim invited me to be a Person of the Month, which was a feature on our Instagram page. And then eventually I became a keynote speaker at our annual Candlelight Vigil, which we just celebrated last week, which was amazing. It's a wonderful job, Kim and Chris. I'm very proud of all the work that our team has done over the years to do, as we always say, connect those in need with those who care. And I'm particularly proud of the initiative we launched last year to bring our cadre of speakers and influencers and educators into the Eastchester school system. I remember thinking at the time, as we were contemplating what direction we would head in as an organization, that two things are true. First, we live in the greatest country in the world. Second, our children are the key to our country's greatness and the key to its future. And that is precisely why we've put the focus on them, on their health, their safety, and their welfare. The programming we have put on thus far has been fantastic. We've covered things like addiction and anxiety, and while the information conveyed has been informative and the speakers eloquent and powerful, you hope that no one listening will need to experience that struggle and that pain so impactfully recounted in the stories that have been presented. Tonight's topic, however, is different. It's different because, without really any exception, everyone in this room has or will experience the loss of a loved one at some point in their lives. We know that with certainty because death is sadly part of life. Put differently, hopefully most of us here will escape the clutches of anxiety, depression, and addiction. But there is no escaping time and the inevitability of its ending for those who pass on. So tonight we're going to talk about grief and loss. We're going to do so hopefully in a way that is both informative and uplifting. We're all going to experience a lot of honest human emotion tonight in this room, with the most important goal being to find comfort, understanding, and peace, or at least to begin to take a small step in that direction. So to that end, let's talk about our agenda. We're going to discuss some traditional models of grief. Grief is really kind of an amorphous concept. It's not easy to get your hands around it. So we're going to look at some models that have been presented over the years to help us better understand what we're experiencing and what we're going through. Then we're going to talk about a personal paradigm from my own experience of grief over these last 11 months, which hopefully you'll derive some value from and hopefully some insight. Then we're going to have a family panel where my sister and I are going to be joined by my brother who's there on Zoom, and we're going to talk about the experiences that we have had over the last year in the wake of the loss of our brother. And then lastly, we'd like to hear from you. We'd like you to ask any questions that you might have of us. Hopefully we can provide some answers. And feel free as well to provide any testimonials yourself about people you have lost in your life, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Now, one thing to bear in mind before we begin. The models that we're going to be talking about, we're going to focus on one more so than the others, is the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. Some of you who have studied psychology may be familiar with this. Let me mention two things before we begin. First of all, I am not a psychologist, I am not a social worker, and I have absolutely no clinical training whatsoever. My lowest grade in college was in Psych 101, and I'm dead serious about that. So take this all with a grain of salt, but I'm giving you my personal experience and how I've experienced these various behaviors and emotions over the last year. Secondly, depending on the circumstance that you experienced in the loss of a loved one, you may have been experiencing some of these emotions or exhibiting some of these behaviors even before the person passed away. In fact, I actually think that some of these things are more prevalent before that person dies rather than in the wake of their passing. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through each of the constituent elements of the cycle. So let's talk a little bit about denial. Denial is behavior, it's an emotion. You don't want to think about what's happening when it's happening. So you hear that somebody is ill, somebody you're very close to, and you want to pretend that life is going to go on as normal. How did this manifest itself in connection with my brother? Well, when he was diagnosed very early on, it was a pill a day. That's all he had to take. It was an oral medication, a immunotherapy drug, which the task of which was to arrest the further development of the cancer. And it worked for a while, and actually the fact that it worked so well for as long as it did, at least a year, added to our ability to sort of deny that there was really anything wrong. You could notice some things going on with him where it was clear that he wasn't himself, but he wasn't losing his hair, he wasn't losing significant weight, all of the things that you sort of associate with somebody who's going through chemotherapy. How did I express denial during this time period? Well, I was in the process of planning a wedding. My wife and I were married last June, and so in the year or so, even longer, that was leading up to Greg's ultimate passing, I was making wedding plans, right up until 4 or 5 months actually before he passed away. I was sending the wedding agenda to him and to his wife, my sister-in-law. I was sending the readings that I wanted Greg to give at the wedding as if he was going to be there and speaking in front of an audience. And I just sort of, in retrospect, it wasn't really fair to be imposing that on him, but he never complained and never criticized. It was only as we got closer to the wedding that my sister-in-law said, you know, Jimmy, he's probably not gonna be there at the ceremony. He'll have to watch it from either home or, as it turned out, to watch it from the hospital. You also saw the denial manifest itself within our family. So we would all say things like, we've got this, you've got this, it's gonna be okay, you know, we're gonna get through this, he's gonna be all right. And you know, look, it's not to say that we didn't all hope that and really believe that inside, but at a certain point in time, it became a lot more of a wish than really something that was a bona fide expectation. So the next phase that Kubler-Ross talks about is anger. So here you find yourself kind of short-tempered. You're lashing out. You're getting angry and upset at things that ordinarily shouldn't really upset you or make you that angry. But you are, because you're in a compromised emotional state. I wanted to be alone a lot. I kind of withdrew. I didn't want to deal with some of the minutia that was going on in my day-to-day life. Not so much before Greg passed away, because I had my wedding to look forward to, and my wife and I were very happy, obviously, prior to getting married. This manifested itself more so after he passed away. I got really resentful about some of the things that I had to do on a day-to-day basis. I can remember the week after he had died, there was several days that went by while the funeral was being planned and the obituary was being drafted, and I knew I was going to take a pretty extended leave of absence from my job. But I remember having to zoom in to my office because of a meeting that the firm was having, and it was mandatory for everybody to attend the meeting. And I remember sitting in that meeting on the other end of Zoom from home, texting one of my close friends from the office saying, what in the heck am I doing at this thing? I couldn't care less about the new document management software, the new security protocol we have for logging into our computers. I thought the whole thing was an absolute, total, and utter waste of time. And everything seemed so small and insignificant at that moment in time. Moving along, there's the bargaining phase. I would say that this is probably going to happen more so before the person passes away rather than after, because after they're gone, there's nothing much to bargain for at that point. What does bargaining look like? You know, God take me instead of him, spare his children. It's yelling and screaming in the chapel at Sloan Kettering, where we all spent an inordinate amount of time. You're just looking for some way to rationalize what's going on and to see if there's some way that you can effectuate some sort of positive change. There's a lot of fantasizing that goes on because there's really nothing much you can do. But you're having conversations with yourself, you're having conversations with God, if you believe in God. And it's a very, there's a lot of torment going on in this bargaining phase. Then you move into to the depressive phase. This, I would say, happens quite a lot after the passing. This is when you don't, as I said, care about much of anything at that period of time. Life has very little meaning and things don't seem as important as you once thought that they were. You have trouble sleeping and eating. You kind of lose interest in the things that used to give you so much joy. The food doesn't taste the same. Wine doesn't taste the same. Nothing is the same because everything's changed. You also find that you don't focus that well. You get distracted easily, you get tired easily, and you lose the ability to effectively communicate with others. I did, and I let a lot of things on my calendar slip. Uncharacteristic of me, I would forget to call clients back, and really didn't stay on top of things the way that I ordinarily would. The last phase on this chart says acceptance. This is where you're supposed to accept the reality of the loss. You have to accept the fact that life has changed. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're happy, but you understand that this is a permanent situation in terms of the fact that your loved one is not going to be physically present anymore. I don't know that I'm quite there, and I don't know that Michael and Mia can talk about this, but that's been a real tough one for me. I don't accept what happened to him. I don't think it was fair, and I don't think I ever really will. So what are the benefits of this model? I think one of the primary benefits of it is that it defines a path, whether it's accurate 100% or not, at least it defines some kind of path. Because grief, I think, is kind of a tangled ball of yarn. You never really are able to dissect it and organize the pieces that well. At least the model seeks to provide some sort of order out of that chaos. I also think that this model accurately defines grief as a process of mixed emotions and behaviors. Because that's really what all this is. Some of it is acting, some of it is what you're experiencing in terms of emotion, but some of it's what you're actually doing and how other people are experiencing you during that time period. So those are some of the virtues, I think, of the model. What do you think, and anyone can answer this question, what do you think is the major deficiency or drawback of this model? Anybody have any ideas? Maybe there is none, maybe it's perfect.
I think just that it's not linear, that it might happen in different orders for different people, that it's hard to compare yourself to a model like this when you might experience all of those things at different times, but sometimes people might experiencing them in a different order.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And sometimes you think you've gotten all the way to acceptance and you just go back to anger.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, while I think it's helpful from an organizational perspective to have some sort of definition to the process, I don't think it's a linear process at all. I really wish it were, but it's really not. But I do think it is helpful to at least provide some kind of a roadmap so you can check yourself and maybe find out where you are along whatever your path happens to be. So we're not going to go into any great detail on some of these other models, but there is a model called the dual process model, which came out after the Kubler-Ross model, and it tries to take a little bit more of a practical, real-world effort at understanding the grief process. And here, along the lines, Kim, of what you were saying, you're constantly fluctuating between a loss-oriented mindset, where you're just thinking about the fact that you've lost this person and experiencing all of those emotions, to the other side of the equation, which I can't see, the restoration-oriented mindset. So here, you're actually trying to rebuild your life and try to get back to some sort of a state of normalcy. But it's a tennis match in this model. You're flip-flopping back and forth between the two. So perhaps more of an accurate representation of the actual process. So how do I experience this? How do I resonate with any of these models? Before I answer this question and I discuss the next slide, which does seek to answer that question, I just want to digress for a moment, because in a week or so we're all going to observe Memorial Day, And what is that? That is actually a national day of mourning and remembrance. And I remember as a kid hearing President Reagan's Memorial Day speech, might have been his first speech on Memorial Day as president. And he said something that has always resonated with me and I think is really applicable to the topic we're talking about tonight. He said that when we mourn the loss of a serviceman or servicewoman, we're actually mourning the loss of two lives. We're mourning the loss of the life that they led, which usually ends in an act of courage and sacrifice. But we're also mourning the life that they would have led. We're mourning the fact that they did not have the opportunity to raise a family, to have children, to see their children grow up, to enjoy their grandchildren. And that's always stuck with me, and it has informed my own experience over these last 11 months as I thought about Greg's passing. For me, it's about mourning the person in the context of three different periods of time. The past. So I mourn the person that I remember. I mourn the person that I grew up with who used to tease me endlessly. I mourn the person who was strong enough to teach me some real serious and heartfelt lessons in my life. And I miss his charm and his sense of humor. As President Reagan said, I also mourn the person that I'll never get to know, the one in the future who would become a grandfather, who would see his two beautiful daughters one day perhaps get married and have their own children, to see him walk his daughters down the aisle at their wedding. And not to try and upstage President Reagan, which for those of you who know me know that I would never do, but I also miss the person in the here and now. I miss him here tonight. I missed him a few weeks ago when I was sitting in church and my niece was getting her confirmation. At that very moment when her name was called, I missed seeing him there at that moment to welcome her as a newly confirmed member of our church. I can put it to you a little bit differently if the past, present, and future model doesn't resonate. If you're a sports fan, maybe this one will work for you. I once described my grief to one of my law partners who was curious as to how I was doing. I said, well, it's a baseball game. It's a baseball game because in baseball there is no clock. The game goes on as long as it does. I know there's a pitch count clock now, but the innings can go on for as long as they go. And here's the kicker. Sometimes there's a rain delay, and the game doesn't make much progress. And around the holidays, or Greg's birthday, or his children's birthday, their wedding anniversary, there's going to be plenty of rain delays. And I don't know where we are right now. Maybe Mia and Michael have an opinion. I think maybe the third inning, maybe. Just a quick reference to prolonged grief disorder. So this is a fairly recent addition to the DSM. The DSM is the Bible of psychiatry, which lists all of the known mental disorders, mental diseases that folks suffer from. So there's a prolonged grief disorder diagnosis now. I'm not going to go through the whole paragraph, but if you find yourself unable to recover from the grief and the severity doesn't tend to wane with time, because we often think time is supposed to make things better, and it does, and it should. But if it doesn't, and you're still feeling the same severity of that pain that you felt in the immediate wake of their passing, then this is something that psychiatry now recognizes as a a diagnosis. So the sibling panel is next. I'm going to bring my brother and sister into the conversation, and I have some questions for them. Before we do that, I'm going to play a very brief video for you from YouTube. It's by an actor who I don't particularly like, but I saw this video on my Instagram feed. You know how like when you have a conversation and all of a sudden your phone just starts sending you stuff that you've been talking about with somebody? It's really kind of weird. I don't like that so much, but it did bring me this video. So I'm going to play this for you now. Listen to it, and then we'll dovetail into the sibling panel. Oops. So boy. Oops. There we go. I don't know if there's a cursor or... Yeah, I don't know why. It worked before when we were... Maybe now, yeah. There you go. No, that's okay.
Goes away. I'm 50% happy and 50% sad in any given moment.
Sorry, guys. There we
Yeah,
go.
I've never been the same since my brother died. There's a melancholy in me that never goes away. I'm 50% happy and 50% sad at any given moment. And the only advice I can give people for when you lose someone like that is you won't ever get over it. And the more you know that and embrace it, the better off you are. I don't want to forget my brother, and I don't want to forget what it felt like when he died, because he deserves it. That's how important he was to me. So if I have to suffer, and if I have to be sad for the rest of my life, and if I have to be lonely without him, without his particular thing, his sense of humor and what he brought to life, then that's the way I honor him. Never been the same since my brother died.
Thank you, Billy. I got you. There we go. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so there's the gang. So Mia, if you could line up. Okay, all right. How about this? I'll sit right here. Okay, Mikey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me,
Okay,
Jay?
I can hear you. I can hear you. We'll get into some more specific questions in a second, but I guess we'll start with a general question. Mike, you better take this one first. It's been a little less than a year at this point. So my question for you to start things off is simply, how are you doing?
You know, I think it's good days and bad days still. You know, I know you were talking about the Kubla Khan or Kubler-Ross model. I can't remember what it was called. But, you know, the person in the audience who mentioned, you know, grief not being linear is 100% correct. You know, I have days where I believe he's still around, days where I can't believe he's gone, and then days where I'm very much aware of it, and it hits me at odd times, you know, and it's not necessarily the big events that hit me. You know, it's not, you know, it wasn't like, you know, Christmas, oh my gosh, I'm so sad. It's those little moments where I would find myself, you know, just texting him when I'm doing like regular everyday things. Like I like to cook. Greg, of course, was one of the best cooks we'll ever know. But I'd always find myself, if I'm cooking, texting him, you know, before he passed. I'm like, hey, I'm making this tonight, what do you think? And now I found whenever I cook, I still have that urge to do that, and I have to remind myself that I can. But overall, I say doing better than I was yesterday, not as good as I'll be tomorrow.
Yeah. Thank you. Mia?
I don't think I'll ever get over it, but I've chosen to look at grief as a product of love. Because if I didn't have the love and the relationship that we had with him, I wouldn't have the grief. So I've chosen to look at it as a gift, even though it's hard at times. I keep reminding myself that, you know, some people might lose a sibling and they don't shed a tear. And I'm grateful for being able to shed the tear because it just, I guess it's just that there was so much love that now there's grief. And that's how I've chosen to look at it. I mean, I've done the avoidance thing. I mean, Greg and I are closer in age. We were 2 years apart, and the twins are 7 years younger than me, so 9 years younger than Greg. So Greg and I had a little bit of a life before
Yeah.
the twins came.
The good old days, I think that's what you call it.
So my relationship, I mean, everyone's relationship is different, as is everyone's grief. And then, you know, to top that off, he lived a mile from me. So after he first passed away, where I live to where our town is, he was like a halfway point. And I found myself taking the long way to town, not to pass his house. And I thought, you know, this is, you know, my sister-in-law and my nieces are in that house, and I can't even drive past the house. Like, you know, I had some struggles. And I do go to grief counseling once a week still. And it's really helped me, and it helps to talk about it, but, you know, I'll never get over it. I don't think anyone gets over it.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned the age difference, because there was this big gap between Greg and then Michael and I coming along, a bit of a surprise, I think, for everybody. And I think you're right. I think our relationship with him has probably influenced how we're going through this process, maybe to some extent. Because you miss him, you know, he was a contemporary, really. I mean, you're only 2 years different, so, you know, you were friends, you were,
It was my best friend.
yeah. Michael, I know you and I are twins, but I think our relationship with Greg was a little bit different. I was the youngest chronologically, because you and I are a minute apart. I'm the youngest of the two of us. So I always felt like the little brother. You know, Greg would kind of refer to me that way. And you were, I don't know, you seemed like you had more of almost a peer relationship with him. Is that a fair statement, or what do you think?
I don't know. I guess I never thought about it like that. I really only got to know Greg well after he opened up Glenville Wine and Spirits, because I started working for him. And, you know, our relationship was different. I mean, he was sort of, you know, you gotta remember, when we were in middle school, he went off to college, and he started working down in Florida after he graduated. So we didn't really have a lot of time with him. And if you remember, when he was really young, he would eat dinner alone in his bedroom when we lived in Florida.
Yeah.
You know, it was, you know, so we really didn't have that much of a relationship with him. At least I'll speak for myself.
Yeah.
until I was older.
Right.
Maybe until he considered me a human being, I'm not sure, but I think it was probably around the time I was 18 or 19. And I really got to know him just working with him at Glenville Wine and Spirits, because I think I pulled more hours down there than you did. You weren't really good with people, Jim. So, you know, he didn't really want you on the floor. That's why we called you Backshed James.
Right,
'Cause we
right.
always
I was good at
doing
moving
back-
boxes, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the physical labor was fine. But yeah, that's when I really got to know him well, was just spending a lot of time with him. And then, of course, you know, his passion for that industry was so infectious. You know, I caught myself picking up, you know, Gregisms as I was, you know, later talking to customers. And part of me, you know, wanted to just impress him because he was, you know, you mentioned this up, you mentioned him being your hero, and I'd say he was sort of mine too, but, you know, more than a hero, a role model.
Yeah.
But it was much later in life. Certainly, I mean, he may have, you know, grew up together, but, you know, I don't feel like he and I did.
Yeah. So I wanna get through this question, because it might be the hardest question to get through, but it might be helpful for people in the audience who, at some point, or maybe they are now, experiencing a loved one who's ill, and everyone is going to play a role to some extent in that process. And I don't know that we've really ever talked about this, but when he was really sick in the last, you know, couple of days, and even the last day, we were all sitting vigil basically at MSK in the city, but we separated for a time, if you remember. I left the hospital to go to the airport, Newark Airport. I never liked Newark Airport, and I certainly hate it even more now. But I went there to pick up Mom and Dad. We finally got them on a flight to get up from Florida. You were with Greg in his room, and Mia was with Carolyn, Greg's wife, getting a coffee or taking a break in the gift shop. So the three of us were all separated, actually, when he passed away. And I remember getting the phone call from you when Mom and Dad were basically deplaning and coming down the baggage claim, and you told me that he passed. Mia was with Carolyn, and rushed up to the room as soon as she heard. And you, of course, were with Greg at that moment. And I don't know how you did it, to be honest. But it strikes me that all of us had a role to play. At least that's the way that things played out. Any advice, Mike, that you can give to people who have a loved one who's ill, and let's say they have siblings or they have cousins, they have people that are involved in the process of helping to care for that person, especially towards the end of their journey? It's not really a very good question, but can you talk about roles and responsibilities and things that people should be cognizant of, maybe?
So, you know, I struggled with that moment for a very long time, and it's a moment that, you know, initially was very haunting for me. And it's a moment that I had with my mother-in-law as well. She died of the same thing at 89 years of age back in 2015, and I was present for that moment as well. You know, gosh, advice for somebody who's maybe who might be in that situation one day. Don't be afraid. Be with your loved one. You may think that they can't hear you. They may be unresponsive. But I remember holding Greg's hand with the rosary wrapped between our hands. Talk to them as if you believe they can hear you. I believe they can hear you, even if they're not responsive. But it is a moment that, I mean, it's an incredibly sad moment. I don't want this to come out, and I've done a lot of reframing of this moment through my own grief process. But it's try to look at it as a blessing and a gift, because this person may have chosen you to be there at that moment. And that's, you know, there's certainly a spiritual component to that belief. And not necessarily, it doesn't have to be religious, but there's a spiritual component to that belief. But be with that person, don't shy away from that moment. It takes strength, but, you know, try to view it as a blessing and your presence as a gift to that person.
Oh, very good. Mia, I'll just ask you, there could be people on this planet stronger than our sister-in-law. If there are, I've never met one. What was it like to be with Carolyn when that news came down? I can't imagine, but you remember what you did and how you helped her?
You know, it wasn't unexpected,
Yeah,
right, that day. It might have been unexpected the week before,
yeah,
but, stoic, I think, and I don't want to speak out of turn, there might have been a sense of relief that he was out of pain.
yeah.
I think,
He was in a lot of pain.
he was in a lot of pain, and, you know, the girls had been there earlier, our nieces. That was a tough moment. And I think Carolyn, there was a sense of, I think, a little bit of a sense of relief
Yeah,
that he was out of pain.
yeah,
So as selfless as she is, and as much as she was losing, I think she was relieved that he was not in pain.
yeah, yeah. I often say of this particular moment that I got off easy, not that it was easy to break the news to mom and dad, but dad just looked at my face. I didn't even have to say anything. He knew exactly what had happened as soon as he saw me down in the baggage claim area. Well, okay, thank you both for those answers. I know that wasn't easy. Let's talk about what kind of coping strategies you've implemented for yourself. I've been dieting. It's a wine and cheese diet, but it's a diet. Mike, I know you're a runner. You've been running half marathons and you've been training real hard. What kinds of things have you been kind of implementing in your life to help you through the grief process that continues?
Well, I mean, you know, running was certainly my go-to. Specifically running at Waveney Park in New Canaan, which is a place where Greg liked to spend a lot of time. He and Carolyn used to like to walk there. And so I'd spend a lot of time there. And you know, running or just walking. There's a pond with a few benches where I would sit and just, you know, meditate, reflect, you know, be with nature. You know, look for those hummingbirds that he always loved. And so that was part of it, spending time alone, spending time in nature, trying to do some positive things versus, you know, sit on the couch, lie in bed, which I did my fair share as well. But also just talking to other people, going through it as well. Sticking close with Mia and you and Carolyn. Turning to my faith for support was a big one. And just trying to think about, look, we live in a world where bad things happen to good people, right? And this was a terrible thing that happened. But, you know, what I try to do is think about something happening for me versus something happening to me. So if I just thought about Greg's death as this awful thing that happened to me and to our family, that would bring me down a really negative path. but I try to think about it as, okay, well, what did I learn from this experience? What gifts did this experience bring to me and bring to my life? And when I started thinking about it that way, and I wrote about this, in my eulogy for Greg, it was more of all these beautiful lessons he taught me. He taught me so many things even through his suffering and through the end stages of his disease. And it was lessons about love. I mean, just the love between him and Carolyn and just that bond, it was so incredibly beautiful and motivating. And that I look at as a true gift, just to be able to witness that and to witness his generosity, his kindness, his compassion for other people. He was filled with gratitude up until the end. And people were coming in and poking and prodding and hurting him. And he would always say thank you to them whenever they left the room. He would always say thank you. So he taught me gratitude, and he taught me, what it means to love and show love. And he taught me how to be strong. So all these things, and that's what I try and think about to help me, process it even more. It's like, what are these great lessons, these beautiful lessons that this terrible event has brought to me in my life to perhaps help make me become a better person. And that might sound selfish, but that, to me, that just reframing my thinking that way has been a tremendous value.
Yeah, thank you. Mia, coping strategies.
Well, I said earlier, I do see a grief counselor weekly.
Yeah.
And she has gotten me through a lot and given me a lot of resources to go and, taking my time to sort of dive into all of them. I see our family priest.
Yeah.
Who has, let me understand that me being angry was okay. Yeah, and, I do, like to Michael's point, I look at, our relationship, we were so fortunate as a family to have siblings who love each other, but not only love each other, like each other, and, have, and have our, so much of our relationship intertwined with each other, our lives, come together a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm thankful for it, and, he was such a conduit to making sure everybody was together, and, you have to, do certain things because we had to make sure that everybody could come, and, he was like the leader of our pack.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, thank you. For me, I've just been keeping in touch with my therapist. One of the things that I worried about, and I think if you asked Michael, he'd probably say, yeah, I was worried about that too, was, I had kind of had a rough patch several years ago, and I was concerned for myself once Greg was passing, what that was going to mean for me and how I was going to respond. And I have done my fair share of random crying fits, driving to work in the morning, ducking out, closing my office door, and just being by myself. Kelly can tell you that my sleep is still not great. Maybe it's getting a little better, but it's not great. And I think that's all kind of a consequence of this to some extent. But, we're all doing the best we can, I guess is the way to put it. Before I just dovetail to the conclusion, I just want to ask the folks here if you have any questions for us, or if you'd like to talk about your own experiences, your own loved ones, friends, whatever. The floor is turned over to you for now. And it's okay if you don't have any questions. Okay. So, before we conclude, I'd like to take us back to the beginning, when I asked you all the question, what do you do when your hero dies? Maybe I'll direct at least an answer to some of the young people who are here and maybe some of them who will watch this at a later time. You know, in the wake of loss, it's easy, it's even understandable to close yourself off from others and to give up on your passions and your goals. That's the way of sadness. It has a way of consuming you and drowning out virtually everything else. But I would submit to you that once the sting begins to subside and that small space begins to open up inside your heart, then you can find a better way, one that involves keeping your departed loved one close to your heart and drawing inspiration from their memory. Think perhaps of the civil rights movement and the leaders of that movement who, following the death of their leader, a 39-year-old preacher from Atlanta, Georgia, effectuated positive change, helping to heal the divisions and mending a tear in the fabric of our society that had been left open for too long. The bad news, ladies and gentlemen, is that you don't fully recover. Not really. I think Billy Bob was right about that. That hole in your heart never fills completely. But what you can do is find purpose and meaning in your suffering. You can do this by reaching out to those in need. If loss has taught us anything, it's the value of time. It's a non-renewable resource. So spend it wisely and don't waste it. Just like my brother Greg was to me, go out and be the hero of someone else's story. Thank you to the Eastchester School District for their support and assistance in putting this program together tonight. Thanks as always to our team at the CARE Coalition for all of your continued hard work. And thank you most of all to all of you for coming this evening. God bless you. Thank you.